In the world remembered by hunters and forgotten by saints, everything begins with blood. Not the warm, ordinary blood that runs through human veins and dries on stone, but a deeper stratum of blood, old as the ruins beneath Yharnam. That blood once moved through things that were not quite gods and not quite beasts, beings that stepped sideways out of comprehension and left only traces in the depths. Scholars would later call it the old blood, and they would speak of it as medicine, sacrament, ladder, and curse all at once. Far beneath the city streets, in tombs carved by a lost civilization, this old blood waited in chalices and channels and ossified vessels. It lay still until human eyes and human hands went looking for transcendence. When Bürgenwerth descended and returned changed, when the healing church rose and began to pour that strange liquid into cups and veins, a new age began. Yharnam swelled with pilgrims. The city's towers grew like jagged teeth around the cathedral ward. The sound of bells and saws and claws became the new rhythm of night. Yet even as Yharnam grew drunk on its own discovery, there was another power watching from across the cold distance, half within that story and half outside of it. Cainhurst. Long before some hunters ever heard the word chalice, there was a castle where the snow never truly melted. It stood beyond the reach of ordinary roads. Its approach drowned in mist and wind, as if the land itself wanted to keep it slightly out of frame. The stone was white, not with innocence, but with age and frost. Spires rose thin and disdainful into a sky that rarely softened. Long windows looked out over nothing like eyes that watched a continent rather than a courtyard. In those halls lived a nobility who thought of themselves as a different kind of people. Their lives were shaped by etiquette and old promises, by family lines counted as carefully as coins. They believed their blood to be finer, rarer, more deliberate than that of the masses in Yharnam's cramped streets. Their cloaks were rich, their masks ornate, their voices soft. Servants moved through corridors with gloved hands and bowed heads. Steel was polished until it reminded one of melted moonlight. Cainhurst's nobles did not become significant because they were numerous. They became significant because they existed at a point where several currents met: the old, self-contained aristocratic world, the new scientific religious world of the healing church, and the invisible pressure of the great ones pushing at human ambition from above and below. In the earliest days, before old blood flowed openly above ground, Cainhurst's power was mundane. It was coin and land and lineage. The nobles held titles recognized far beyond their snowy estate. Their riders traversed the countryside. Their banners appeared at distant courts. In those days, Yharnam was simply one more city among many, not yet the axis of a bloody faith. What made Cainhurst different was how it understood the idea of refinement. In Yharnam, when people began to hear whispers of miraculous blood, they thought of healing. They imagined sickness turning backward and old wounds sealing over. In Cainhurst, the thought moved in another direction. The nobles already had comfort, long life, and walls that kept ordinary fear outside. What they desired was polish, purity, a distillation of themselves into something that would never tarnish. They kept meticulous genealogies. They preserved relics of their ancestors in cabinets of glass and velvet. They believed that through careful breeding, strict custom, and subtle rituals, a family line could be hardened into something almost immutable. Not divine, not yet, but poised. When the labyrinths beneath Yharnam were breached, this quiet ideology met its catalyst. Byrgenwerth's discovery did not initially announce itself to the world. A small cadre of scholars returned from the depths bearing texts, chalices and blood whose properties disturbed even them. In their halls by the water, they debated what they had found. Some looked at the old blood and saw the engine that had turned a forgotten civilization into something that could carve cathedrals beneath the earth. Others saw the same substance and tasted disaster. At first, these disagreements were contained within cloistered rooms. The world outside remained largely ignorant, but secrets that involve power and fear rarely stay folded forever. In time, one of the scholars broke ranks. The precise name of the traitor is never written in clean ink, and later generations speak of that figure only in circumlocutions. The one who carried forbidden blood, the one who crossed the snow, the one who bent the knee in a foreign hall. What matters is that someone from Byrgenwerth took a portion of what had been found in the tombs and carried it far from Yharnam. Across the frozen approaches, through mists that clung to cloaks and lashes, that scholar came to Cainhurst Castle. By then, the nobles had already heard rumors. There were always guest rooms in Cainhurst for scholars, hunters, or emissaries who might amuse the court. Letters reached them before the pilgrims did. They knew that a college in Yharnam had unearthed something potent, something tied to old gods and older failures. They knew that the Healing Church, an offshoot of that same college, had begun to build its own authority atop blood rites in the city. When the scholar finally stood beneath Cainhurst's vaulted ceilings and unstoppered the vial, the reaction was not panic. It was interest. Here at last was a substance that matched the nobility's dreams of refinement. The old blood was not simply curative. It was transformative. It carried traces of beings that had moved beyond the human condition. To a queen who measured her worth in the continuity of her line, to courtiers who measured their worth in the clarity of their ancestry, this was more than medicine. It was an instrument. The earliest experiments in Cainhurst did not look like Yharnam's public ministrations. There were no long lines in chapel squares, no mass distributions to commoners. The blood was kept in carefully warded chambers. It was administered slowly in controlled quantities to a limited circle of nobles. It moved through crystal and silver, not tin and wood. It was woven into ceremonies that already existed and altered them by degrees. At first, the changes were subtle. A lord whose lungs had been weak since childhood began to ride in the winter air without coughing. A lady whose hands trembled when she held a goblet found that her grip grew steady and her eyes sharp. Wounds taken in practice, duels closed with unexpected speed. Those who drank more regularly reported dreams that felt unusually lucid. In those dreams, pale figures watched from unguessable distances. Cainhurst's court, already enamored with the idea of its own exceptionality, saw this as confirmation. If the old blood could be guided, they believed it could polish away the last imperfections that tied them to the common run of humanity. It could hone their bodies, their minds, their very lineage into something approaching the beings hinted at in the labyrinth beneath Yharnam. They began to speak of a new lineage, not separate from the old nobility, but its flowering. A line touched directly by this forbidden current. Over time, the whispered name for this line hardened into a title, Vilebloods. In Yharnam, the word would later be spat by certain fanatics as an accusation. In Cainhurst, at the beginning, it carried a different flavor. It suggested blood that had been transformed beyond ordinary human categories, a blood that drew its strength from what the healing church would come to declare unclean. At the center of this emerging order stood the Queen. Annalise is remembered by later hunters as an undying monarch, trapped between death and continuity, but that image belongs to the very end of her story. In the earlier chapters, she was a mortal woman standing at the convergence of old and new currents. She inherited a court steeped in protocol and pride. She watched as emissaries from Yharnam came and went, bringing news of how the healing church's miracles were reshaping the city's fortunes. She listened as scholars described beings who existed beyond the human frame and as priests debated whether such beings should be named gods. In that environment, the old blood did not appear to her primarily as a danger. It appeared as a means to guarantee that Cainhurst would not be eclipsed. The Queen's Council wrestled with that thought. Some advisors urged caution, pointing to the unknown origin of the blood, the risk of contagion, the way even Bergenwerth's more optimistic voices spoke in wary tones. Others dismissed those concerns as the fears of scholars who had grown too accustomed to limits. Cainhurst had not survived on timidity. In the end, Annalise chose a middle path, or thought she did. The castle would not become a public clinic. It would not imitate the healing church's broad blood ministrations. Instead, Cainhurst would specialize. It would take the old blood and refine its use among the nobility alone. It would fold it into existing rights of inheritance and marriage, ensuring that any change in the family line was deliberate, measured. The first of the Vilebloods were those nobles who accepted this arrangement. They did not fling themselves into excess. Their cups did not overflow in the streets. They drank in candlelit chambers under the eyes of physicians and scholars. They recorded each transfusion with the same care they used when annotating family trees. For a while, results seemed to justify their confidence. The Vileblood nobles grew more resilient, their senses sharpened. Their movements in the dance halls and on the practice grounds took on a strange fluidity, as if they existed half a heartbeat ahead of everyone else. Some of them learned a technique that hunters elsewhere would later call quickening, a way of moving that felt like stepping sideways out of the ordinary rhythm of time. Witnesses described them as blurring across marble floors, circling opponents faster than eyes could follow. This art would find echoes in other places, in other students of Bergenwerth and its offshoots, but Cainhurst was one of the courts where it became an emblem of status. Yet every power in this world arrives with a ledger of limits. The old blood never belonged to humans. It was a medium that once ran through the great ones and their kin, creatures whose minds did not work along human lines. Even administered carefully, even woven into ceremony rather than frenzy, it carried impulses that strained against the frame that received it. Those who drank it opened themselves to influences they did not fully understand. In Cainhurst, the side effects were easier to conceal than in Yharnam. There were no crowded tenements where an outbreak could spill instantly onto the streets. There were high walls, private chambers, and servants accustomed to silence. When a noble woke from a dream with eyes too bright and fingernails digging into the bedpost, only a few saw. When a courtier grew pale and distant, speaking in fragments about distant choirs, the behavior was attributed to temperament rather than transformation. The castle learned to fold these changes into its image of itself. If a noble became withdrawn, they were deemed contemplative. If another became prone to sudden, unnatural grace, they were envied. If shadows in certain corridors seemed to move behind people when they walked, that was a matter for candle placement, not theology. All the while, the healing church was growing. Lawrence, once a student at Bergenwerth, had taken the old blood into the heart of Yharnam and turned it into a new religion that claimed both practical and spiritual authority. The church established its own hierarchy. It clothed its clergy in vestments that echoed familiar faiths while quietly shifting their focus to the blood beneath everything. Its clinics drew crowds of the sick and hopeful. Its hunters patrolled the city's nights, cleaning up the consequences of misuse as discreetly as possible. The church did not openly advertise its relationship with Cainhurst, but there were points of contact. Blood had to come from somewhere. The church drew much of its stock from the labyrinths and from certain carefully controlled donors in Yharnam. Yet there are hints, in scattered descriptions and item notes, that the early healing church was also deeply familiar with Cainhurst's distinctive blood, and that certain exchanges of knowledge and resources took place between cathedral and castle. In return for funding and influence, Cainhurst is implied to have received access to rare insights and specimens. For a time, this uneasy partnership served both sides. Yharnam grew into a city defined by its church. Cainhurst retained its remote authority and drifted further toward a blood aristocracy that considered itself superior not just to common humanity, but to the very institution that supplied its miracles. The Vileblood nobles began to see the healing church not as a parent or patron, but as a tool, a middle step in their own ascent. Annalise's dream shifted accordingly. Somewhere beneath Yharnam there had been another queen, remembered later as a veiled figure stained in blood, who had carried a child of a great one at the very edge of human possibility. The remnants of that story haunted the deep city's sleep. To a queen who now ingested a refined form of the same power, the idea of bearing a similar offspring did not seem impossible. If anything, it seemed like the logical culmination of Cainhurst's philosophy. A child that would anchor the line in something beyond mortality. Thus, the pursuit of refined blood became tied in Cainhurst to the pursuit of a particular kind of future. Blood gathered from ordinary worshippers could make a person strong or whole, but it might not suffice for such an ambitious aim. The Vilebloods began to seek blood that had already been tested in extremity, blood that had circulated through hunters who faced beasts, through humans driven to the edge of their limits. They harvested traces of that blood in what would later be called dregs, tiny congealed testimonies to the extremes someone had endured. To Cainhurst, these were more than trophies. They were seeds. Within the castle, special vessels were set aside for this purpose. Each fragment added to the collection brought the queen, in her own estimation, a little closer to conceiving a child that would truly belong to both human and Great One spheres. The Vileblood Order took on a more defined shape around this goal. It had its own knights, its own oaths, its own sense of destiny rooted not in conquest of cities but in the refinement of a single, pivotal bloodline. From Yharnam's perspective, this looked very different. The healing church increasingly presented itself as the guardian of pure blood usage, the arbiter of who was allowed to participate in the miracle and on what terms. When rumors spread that Cainhurst's nobility were taking the blood down darker paths, that they were trafficking in the remains of those slain on hunts or using their access to church research for their own experiments, the church reacted with alarm. Officially, the old blood was now a sacred medium whose use was tightly regulated by church doctrine. Unofficially, there were already splinter groups pushing its application to extremes. The choir delving into communion with entities like Ebrietas, the school of Mensis pursuing madness in the guise of revelation. Against that backdrop, Cainhurst's independent program was more than a theological disagreement. It was competition. The church began to speak of Cainhurst in darker terms, in sermons and private briefings, in letters that moved between cathedrals. The narrative hardened. A scholar had betrayed Bergenwerth and polluted the noble castle with forbidden blood. The nobles had become fiendish and bloodthirsty. Their practices threatened the purity of the church's miracle and the moral fabric of society. If left unchecked, this aristocratic coven might spread its corruption until no boundary remained between human and monster. Some of these accusations held slivers of truth twisted to serve a purpose. The Vilebloods were indeed experimenting outside church control. Their obsession with lineage and refined blood did lead them to treat the lives and deaths of others as material. But the role of propaganda cannot be separated from the story. The healing church needed an enemy that could be clearly denounced, a foil against which it could define itself as protector. From this need, a particular kind of warrior order emerged. Even before Cainhurst became their primary focus, there were men in Yharnam who reacted to the scourge of beasts with a severity that went beyond ordinary hunting. To them, those cursed by the blood were not unfortunate victims to be pitied, but abominations to be purged. When tales of Cainhurst's vampiric nobility reached their ears, the castle became to them what the beast-plagued streets of old Yharnam had been to others, a symbol of what must be cut away in order to save the whole. These men formed the nucleus of the executioners. Where the church's ordinary hunters moved swiftly and discreetly, culling beasts in the folds of the city's night, the executioners were built around a different image. Their sign was a great spiked wheel, a symbol of judgment that crushed and ground. Their armor was heavy. Their presence was not subtle. They did not aspire to walk unseen. They aspired to be a visible answer to visible corruption. Among them, one name rose highest: Logarius. In later years, he would be remembered as Martyr Logarius, a figure frozen in a single posture atop Cainhurst's roof, his vigil stretching beyond death. Before that stillness, however, he was a living man shaped by the convergence of fear, duty, and belief. He listened to the church's accounts of Cainhurst's sins. He read what little could be pried from Bergenwerth's guarded records. He spoke with those who claimed to have seen the castle's nobility indulge in forbidden rites. Whether all those stories were true mattered less to him than what they collectively suggested. A rival blood cult entrenched in a fortress and led by a queen who sought to twist the miracle of the blood toward her own line. To a mind like Logarius's, the conclusion felt inevitable. If the old blood was dangerous even when administered in moderation by the church, how much more dangerous when used recklessly by nobles who answered to no one? If the scourge of beasts had begun to eat away at Yharnam's lower districts, what would happen if a similar or worse transformation took place behind Cainhurst's walls, among people with resources and influence across the region? In the councils where the church debated what to do, other voices urged patience, diplomacy, and quiet pressure. There were entanglements to consider, old alliances, shared research, the difficulty of launching a campaign against a remote fortress without drawing unwanted attention to the true nature of the blood-based miracles. Annalise's Cainhurst was not yet a smoking ruin in church imagination. It was an object of unease surrounded by a web of politics. Logarius had less patience for those considerations. He argued with a fervor that struck some as holy and others as fanatic that Cainhurst represented a contagion in the body of the world. To excise that contagion, half measures would not suffice. One did not bargain with blood that had already turned against its appointed bounds. One did not negotiate with an aristocracy that built its future on what he saw as vampiric theft. Little by little, his conviction won adherents. The executioners, once a loosely defined tendency, coalesced into a distinct order under his influence. They trained not merely to fight beasts in streets, but to storm stone, to crush a court, to erase a bloodline. Their weapons were chosen for their brutal clarity. Their theology was simple. No quarter for those who had, in their view, sold their humanity to forbidden blood. Somewhere in this process, the decision was made. The details are lost in the fog of conflicting accounts, but at some point the healing church sanctioned an action that would later be remembered as the war with Cainhurst. Whether it was presented officially as a holy crusade or initiated under the cover of a more mundane dispute, the result was the same. A plan was drawn up to send Logarius and his executioners across the snow into the storm, to bring ruin to the Vileblood court. The moment before departure sits at the hinge of Cainhurst's story. In Yharnam, the decision may have felt like a grim necessity, one more harsh measure in an age already thick with them. In Cainhurst, there is no sign that the castle fully understood what was coming. Its nobles had enemies and rivals, as any power does, but they had grown used to being untouchable behind their remote walls and swirling snow. Their attention remained fixed on internal rituals, on the refinement of bloodlines, on the queen's slow pursuit of a child who would close the loop between human ambition and Great One detachment. The world, however, had begun to move in a different rhythm. The old blood carried memories of civilizations that had once soared and fallen. The Great Ones watched in their distant, unfocused way as another set of mortals tried to step beyond themselves using the same medium. Yharnam's towers cast longer shadows. Cainhurst's spires cut more sharply into the sky. Hunters walked beneath a moon that seemed each night a little too attentive. On a day when the snow fell in thick, sound-dampening sheets, ships pushed away from Yharnam's docks. Their decks carried armored men, wheels of judgment, and a leader whose resolve had hardened into something like stone. The sea between city and castle churned beneath them. Wind tore at banners. Somewhere beyond the mist, Cainhurst's pale height waited, unaware that it was about to pass from the realm of living politics into the realm of frozen legend. Logarius stood at the prow, his gaze fixed on that invisible horizon. Behind him, the executioners murmured their oaths. Ahead of him lay a fortress filled with nobles who believed their blood had already risen above consequence. Between them stretched the last span of distance where another choice might have been made. The ships pressed on. The snow closed around them. Cainhurst, in all its icy pride, was about to learn what happens when two visions of blood, purity, and refinement meet without restraint. Not yet, though, in this telling. For a moment longer, the castle stands untouched in the storm, its halls lit by candelabras. its queen seated in undisturbed poise, its Vilebloods dreaming of an immortal child. The sea has not yet delivered its iron answer. The rooftop where a martyr will someday kneel is still just stone. The fall has not yet begun, but every necessary thread is already in place, pulled taut between ambition and judgment. The rise of Cainhurst is complete. What follows when the ships reach the shore and the executioners set foot on frozen ground will be the reckoning that turns that rise into a legend of ruin. The ships reached the shore when the snow was thick enough to blur the horizon into a single pale wall. Cainhurst's cliffs rose out of that whiteness like the spine of a buried creature, all knuckles and teeth. For generations the castle had trusted that distance and cold to keep misfortune at bay. Now they served only to muffle the sound of oars against wood and armor shifting as men prepared to land. When the executioners disembarked, the sea wind caught their cloaks and wheels. Iron rang softly under the heavy sky. They were not many compared to the number of souls inside the castle, but each man carried with him a conviction as dense as stone. In their minds, Cainhurst had already been condemned. They walked as if they were merely catching up to a sentence that had been spoken long ago. The first figures to see them were servants tending to the outer approaches, workers accustomed to snow and silence, not war. For an instant the scene remained almost mundane. Wool cloaks, laden baskets, a narrow path swept clear of ice. Then the strangers lifted their weapons, and the air filled with the dull percussion of impacts meeting flesh and cloth and frozen ground. The details of that day would later dissolve into a single word in the few records that survived: massacre. It was not a campaign or a sequence of formal engagements. It was a raid with a purpose that did not require nuance. The executioners advanced through Cainhurst's courtyards and halls, and everything that matched their idea of a Vileblood was cut down. In the grand rooms where nobles once danced, where mirrors multiplied candlelight into endless golden corridors, the invaders found their quarry. Cainhurst's aristocracy did not meet them in open ranks on a battlefield. They were scattered through the castle, some in armor, others in night clothes, some clutching weapons honed more for ceremony than war. A few tried to wield the quickening arts that their refined blood had sharpened, flickering across marble floors with supernatural agility. It did not save them. There were too many corridors to defend, too many doorways, too many points where wheels could be set spinning and judgment made literal. The castle's servants, those plain figures who had moved through its rituals unnoticed, were not the primary target. The executioners had come for the nobility, for those who held the tainted lineage and the forbidden rites. The servants might be spared or overlooked, left alive among the ruins like ghosts in training. The nobles, particularly those who bore the queen's blood in their veins, would be given no such leniency. Through it all, Cainhurst's queen remained at the heart of the storm. Annalise's throne room was less a place of government than a stage where the castle's myth about itself crystallized. Silver and dark wood, crimson fabrics, smooth stone underfoot, and above it all, the figure of the queen seated with an air that mixed boredom, poise, and a quiet, cold curiosity. She had built herself into the axis of the Vileblood order. In her presence, every experiment, every oath, every drop of refined blood found its meaning. When Logarius reached her, the raid took on the shape of a legend. The battle between the executioner leader and the queen's defenders is never described in detail by any surviving text. Hunters who climb to that rooftop centuries later sense only echoes, as if the arena itself remembers exertion and shattering force. What matters in the story is not the choreography of each strike, but the outcome. The Vilebloods, as a living court, were destroyed. Their covenant was broken in public form, their nobles reduced to corpses and restless spirits. Yet for all his zeal, Logarius did not remove the queen from the world. Annalise had consumed more blood than any other in the castle, letting it steep in her body until it blurred the line between mortality and something else. When executioners tried to end her with the same brutal certainty they applied to other nobles, they found that her death did not behave as it should. The details are left deliberately vague in the lore, but the conclusion is clear. She persisted. Her body refused to resolve itself into the neat stillness that judgment required. For Logarius, this created a crisis. The purpose of the raid had been to erase the Vileblood threat. To leave its leader alive, even as a chained prisoner, would be to accept a seed of corruption that might sprout again. Yet he could not complete the last act of violence. The Queen's state defied his expectations of mortality. Killing her over and over only to watch her remain somehow would have turned judgment into something obscene. There was another option suggested by Cainhurst's own secrets. Among the castle's relics was a crown tied to an old king, a piece of regalia that did more than signify authority. When worn in the right place, it pierced illusions. It exposed hidden passages and rooms, folding the castle in a way that allowed those who understood it to pass through veils unseen by others. Logarius in his search came upon this artifact and grasped its potential. He put the crown upon his own head. The act was more than tactical. It was a kind of self-sentencing. By donning the crown, Logarius accepted not only access to Cainhurst's deepest secret, but the burden of sealing it away. The throne room where he stood cracked and reshaped itself, revealing a concealed wing, a hidden chamber where the queen could be locked beyond the reach of ordinary hunters. There, deep in the castle, Annalise was bound to a throne she could never truly leave. Logarius sealed the room and then returned to the heights, to the rooftop that looked out over the frozen sea. He sat upon a throne of his own making, a seat carved from determination and guilt, and began a vigil that would outlast his life. To the church and the executioners, the raid was declared a success. Their reports spoke of Cainhurst's nobility wiped out, of a blood cult crushed, of a corrupted line severed at last. If any mention was made of the surviving queen, it was buried in marginalia or spoken aloud only in rare, private conversations. Publicly, Logarius was named a martyr, a figure whose sacrifice anchored the church's moral narrative. The castle was written off as forsaken, its isle left to the elements and the restless dead. Time moved forward. Snow layered itself over the ruins year after year, smoothing sharp edges, softening broken battlements. The survivors among the servants did not leave. They faded instead into an existence half physical, half echo. Their forms grew translucent, their habits calcified into ghostly routines, dusting banisters that no longer needed care, pouring wine into empty air, bowing to absent nobles. Something had changed at the level of the castle's spirit. The old blood that had soaked its stones did not vanish with the death of its aristocrats. It seeped into every flagstone and pillar, into tapestries and portraits. It gave shape to new inhabitants, twisted reflections of human and beast that stalked the ramparts and roof. Bat-like creatures with human features took up positions along the high edges, waiting in ambush for any who might be drawn there again. They were called, in one clinical description, lost children of antiquity, as if they were leftovers from an earlier experiment or curse that had found a home in Cainhurst's heights. The healing church turned Cainhurst into a cautionary tale. In sermons, the castle was cast as an object lesson in the dangers of unregulated blood rites. The Vilebloods were described as fiendish aristocrats who had threatened the purity of the church's miracle. Their genocide was presented as a grim but necessary intervention, a surgical strike to preserve the broader flock. Over time, this version of events hardened into doctrine. Those who heard it in their youth and believed it without question carried that story in their hearts as they became hunters and clerics. One of those listeners grew into a man named Alfred. Alfred's life before Yharnam is not detailed in any surviving record. He enters the hunter's tale as a wandering figure in simple armor, kneeling in prayer beneath a broken sky. His devotion is directed toward the executioners and especially toward martyr Ligarius. He speaks of them with an earnest admiration that has no room for nuance. For Alfred, the world is made clearer by the wheel. Those who submit to blood in the wrong way must be crushed. From his lips, the Vilebloods are not merely doctrinally suspect. They are almost mythic monsters, enemies whose existence justifies any act committed against them. The idea that Cainhurst might have its own grievances or that the church's account might be incomplete does not occur to him. His faith is simple, genuine, and absolute. While this ideology settles into human hearts, the castle itself waits. For a long time, no one comes. The sea continues to turn. The snow continues to fall. Ghosts continue to walk their invisible routes through corridors lined with empty frames and shattered mirrors. On the rooftop, Ligarius's body remains seated in its unnatural stillness, the bones locked into a posture of eternal readiness. In the sealed chamber, beyond illusion, Annalise sits unaging, locked in a fragment of time. Her blood remains potent. Her covenant remains nominally intact, even if no knights are left to answer it. Then at some point deep into Yharnam's long, nightmare-drenched night, an invitation stirs. In a clinic not far from the beating heart of the city, a letter lies waiting. It is old, stained in a way that suggests dried blood rather than simple ink. It is addressed inexplicably to a specific hunter who has not yet come to Yharnam when the letter was written. Its contents are simple: a summons to the forsaken castle, instructions not to hesitate, and a note about a stagecoach that departs from a place where executioners once gathered. When the hunter eventually finds this letter, the threads woven through Cainhurst's story tighten. The journey begins at Hemwick, in a clearing where large, brutish figures once associated with execution prowl among gravestones. There, a stone monument stands. When approached by the invited, a carriage arrives without driver or visible horses, its form dragging itself from mist and moonlight. It is an old thing, a conveyance that remembers another age. The hunter climbs aboard. The doors close. The coach sets off toward the icy horizon. The ride is quiet. Snow swirls around the carriage. The sound of hooves thudding on unseen ground is muffled, as if distance itself is folding. The hunter sits between what was and what is, carried toward the most complete ruin left by the quarrel over blood. There is no branching path, no decision point. The invitation, once accepted, delivers its guest to the castle without asking for further consent. Cainhurst's gates rise from the mist as if the coach is arriving not at a place but at a memory. The first impression is of stillness. Snow clings to the outer walls. The courtyard is frozen in mid-neglect. Statues lie broken at the base of stairways. Doors hang askew on rusted hinges. Somewhere within, a bell tolls that no living hand is ringing. The hunter lights a lantern at the entrance, staking a fragile claim of warmth in a place that has largely forgotten it. Inside, the castle reveals the imprint of the life it once held. Portraits line the corridors, faces of nobles painted with meticulous attention to jewelry, fabrics, and posture. Some have been slashed, others hang askew. Their eyes follow the hunter with a mixture of accusation and curiosity. In certain rooms, broken glasses and bottles litter the floor, remnants of feasts that ended in panic. Chairs are overturned as if someone rose too quickly and never returned to set them right. The first enemies encountered are not beasts in the Yharnam sense, but wraith-like servants, their uniforms tattered, their movements tinged with hesitancy. They lurch and glide through the halls, attacking intruders with blades and tools they once used for service. Their faces are drawn and pale. Their existence seems anchored not by hunger but by routine and resentment. These are the remnants of those spared in the raid, left to a slow, half-spectral decline. Their persistence is not a choice. It is a consequence of having lived too close to an experiment that reshaped the nature of death. Higher up, along the outer ramparts and rooftops, the lost children of antiquity wait. They cling to stone with claws and strange, tattered wings. Their bodies resemble twisted birds or bats, but their faces retain disturbingly human outlines. They attack with a shriek and a flurry of movement, as if drawn by some residual mandate to defend the castle from invaders. Their origin remains ambiguous. Some scholars interpret them as failed products of Cainhurst's own attempts at refinement, forgotten experiments that sought to bridge human and Great One configurations. Others see them as manifestations of the castle's lingering curse, coagulated fear given form. The game never settles the question. It only places them there, on the threshold between sky and stone, as a warning. As the hunter pushes deeper, signs of the Vileblood order surface. A set of armor gleams faintly beneath layers of dust, silver plates that are lighter than they appear. Their design is elegant, almost ceremonial, with delicate curves and thin edges. The description associated with this attire explains why it feels so insubstantial. It was fashioned to deflect blood with ill intent rather than ordinary blows, enabling the royal guards to capture prey for their queen, so that she might one day realize her ambition to bear a child of blood. In that one sentence, a covenant between function and fantasy crystallizes. The armor protected those who fed Annalise's dream. For the hunter moving through these halls, the past is not merely something to be read. It is something to be walked through. Each enemy, each item, each vista over the abandoned courtyard is a fragment of a narrative that can only be reconstructed in broad strokes. The details remain slightly out of reach, as if the city and the castle colluded with the Great Ones to keep some distance between truth and interpretation. Lore keepers and players can speculate about the exact terms of Cainhurst's association with the church, about the specific rituals used to refine blood, but the castle offers only impressions and tokens, never a clean ledger. At last, the hunter reaches the rooftop where the wind tears at cloaks and the sea roars far below. There, seated on a throne of frost and restraint, waits Martyr Logarius. He is no longer quite alive, but not yet fully gone. His body moves with a stiffness that suggests centuries of immobility and constant strain. He fights with scythe-like swings and bursts of arcane force, wielding the very powers he once sought to keep from Cainhurst's grasp. In his hands, even the weapons of the executioners become a kind of curse, binding him to the castle he thought he had purified. When the hunter finally defeats him, the air seems to lighten by a measure. Logarius falls, his vigil broken. In death, he relinquishes the claim he held over Cainhurst's secret. The hunter, standing where he once stood, discovers the crown that had allowed the executioner leader to see beyond the castle's illusions. It is an object heavy with intent. When placed upon the hunter's head, it reveals the hidden chamber that Logarius dedicated his afterlife to concealing. The wall behind the rooftop throne dissolves into mist and then resolves into a corridor. At the end of that corridor waits Annalise. She sits upon a throne of her own, surrounded by dark drapery and dim reddish light. Her attire is regal, her posture composed. Masked and veiled, she appears untouched by the centuries that have stripped everything else in the castle down to bone and dust. Item descriptions and character notes identify her as the undead queen leader and last true member of the Cainhurst Vilebloods. Though her court has been slaughtered or scattered, she persists, anchored by blood to a state where ordinary decay cannot claim her. In this secluded room, the Cainhurst covenant still breathes. The queen addresses the hunter not as an enemy, but as a potential knight. She offers an oath, one that binds the hunter to her service in exchange for recognition as a Vileblood. Those who accept become part of a chain that reaches back to the days before the raid, a continuation of a dream that refused to die. Their task is simple in structure and complex in implication. They are to hunt other hunters and bring back concentrated residues of their blood, dregs of experience and transformation which Annalise consumes. Each such offering deepens the Queen's connection to the extraordinary qualities that the old blood can produce. Each deepens her hope that one day she will bear the child of blood her knights were always meant to secure. The covenant is described in the lore as one where members share in her corrupted blood while simultaneously feeding it, a closed loop that sustains both queen and knight. This vision of Cainhurst preserved in a hidden chamber stands in sharp contrast to the story preached by the healing church. From the church's perspective, the Vilebloods are fiends who consume blood merely for personal gain. They threaten the purity of the church's miracle, and their queen is a blasphemous figure whose continued existence is an affront to the order that Logarius tried to impose. The existence of a living, speaking Annalise beneath the castle roof is, therefore, a scandal. It reveals that the raid did not accomplish what its admirers claim. Something remains, something that could inspire doubt in the faithful. That is where Alfred re-enters the story. If the hunter chooses to share the location of Annalise's chamber with him, Alfred reacts as if a lifelong prayer has been answered. To stand where Logarius once stood is in his eyes a holy privilege. To finish the work his idol started, or believes he started, is a calling. The journey that follows is not shown in detail. The game does not depict Alfred's walk through the ruined castle, or the look on his face when he stands before the queen. It only reveals the result. When the hunter returns to Annalise's chamber after informing Alfred, the throne is empty. On the floor lies a ruin of flesh, pulsing faintly, accompanied by a sense that something terrible and irreversible has occurred. Alfred has destroyed the Queen's body as completely as he knows how. He has taken the image of the Vileblood monarch that haunted his imagination and smashed it into a formless mass. He sees this as victory. When next encountered, he kneels in a pool of blood, laughing and praising the triumph of the executioners, before finally succumbing to his own end beneath a statue outside the city. His life's purpose in his own evaluation is complete. Read it. The fragment left behind by Annalise's destruction becomes known as queenly flesh. Its description emphasizes how wrong it is that it remains warm, that it refuses to behave like an ordinary remnant. Hunters who pick it up report a faint, cursed vitality, as if the Queen's defiance of death persists even in this reduced form. With it later, one can perform a ritual at a hidden altar beneath the city, in a place where another great one lingers to bring Annalise back. Her body reconstitutes, her throne is occupied once more, and the cycle of the Vileblood covenant resumes. Bloodbornewiki.com. In that restoration, another layer of Bloodborne's cosmology reveals itself. The Great Ones are said to be sympathetic to the loss of their children. They move in cycles of birth and disappearance that leave scars on worlds and minds. Annalise's dream is, in a sense, an echo of theirs. She wishes to bear a child whose existence would bridge the gap between her blood and the more distant, ineffable blood of the Great Ones. That this dream can be paused by violent dismemberment but not permanently destroyed suggests that it is tied into something larger than her personal will. The altar that restores her stands in the shadow of Ebrietas, a great one who lingers behind the facade of a cathedral. The hunter who revives Annalise does so by presenting her remains in that place under that gaze. The mechanics of how the Queen's body reassembles are not explained. They do not need to be. All that matters is the symbolism. The human attempt at immortality is ultimately dependent on something non-human observing and permitting it. Bloodbornewiki.com. The rise and fall of Cainhurst, viewed from this vantage, becomes less a simple morality tale about arrogance and punishment, and more a study in how different human groups respond to the same incomprehensible stimulus. The healing church encountered the old blood and saw a miracle that could be institutionalized, used to heal, convert, and control. Its hierarchy grew around that function. Its hunters fought to maintain the balance between public blessing and private horror. The Vilebloods encountered the same power and saw an opportunity to refine themselves into something beyond ordinary mortality, to incubate a line that would produce a child aligned with the Great Ones. Both paths led to tragedy. In Yharnam, the scourge of beasts spread through streets that had grown dependent on blood ministrations. In Cainhurst, a genocide shattered an entire court, leaving only ghosts and a queen too saturated with blood to die. The church presented its version of events as righteous intervention. Cainhurst's story, unvoiced and scattered across item descriptions and broken architecture, suggests a more complicated reality in which both parties used the blood as a means of self-exaltation, and both paid a price. Logarius remains a figure caught between these perspectives. To Alfred and those who share his devotion, he is a saint of slaughter, a martyr whose vigil atop Cainhurst roof sanctified the church's stance against the Vilebloods. To others, he is a tragic figure who undertook a genocidal mission and then found, too late, that its consequences could not be cleaned away. By choosing to remain on the roof rather than return to Yharnam, he effectively imprisoned himself. His death at the hunter's hands centuries later reads less as the defeat of an enemy and more as the release of someone who could not break his own chains. Annalise likewise exists in tension. To the church and its executioners, she is an undying abomination, a focal point of forbidden blood usage whose very persistence is intolerable. To those who kneel before her, she is a sovereign who refused to let the scourge or the raid erase her line. In her, the human desire for continuity and the Great One preoccupation with offspring intertwine. She does not speak in terms of cosmic enlightenment or collective salvation. Her focus is narrow and personal, her child, her blood, her court. Cainhurst itself is the third character in this triad. The castle's architecture encodes its philosophy. Vertical, elegant, and remote, it stands apart from Yharnam's dense, tangled streets. Its portraits and armor, its silver and velvet testify to a culture that values appearance, refinement, and lineage. Even in ruin, those values persist in altered form. The ghosts maintain decorum as they attack. The lost children of antiquity cling to their perches like grotesque gargoyles guarding a sanctuary that no longer deserves the name. Against this backdrop, the hunter moves like a temporal anomaly. Raised into the hunt in a different age, drawn into Yharnam's nightmares by a different set of needs, the hunter nonetheless finds themselves reenacting and resolving echoes of older conflicts. They retrace Logarius's steps, confront his lingering will, unveil Annalise's chamber and choose, consciously or not, a stance toward the Vileblood dream. They can join her covenant and bring her dregs, thus perpetuating Cainhurst's ambition. They can refuse and leave her in isolation, her line reduced to a single undying point. They can guide Alfred to her and end her body for a time. Each choice produces a slightly different pattern in the story's weave. In all cases, however, Cainhurst remains forsaken. The ghosts do not stop walking. The snow does not stop falling. Even if Annalise is revived and hunters kneel again in her service, the castle never returns to its former prominence. It has become a place out of step with the present, a side path off the main road of Yharnam's tragedies, visited only by those who find the summons and accept its inexplicable authority. In that sense, its fall is less about fire and collapse, and more about being slid into the margins of history. From a cosmic vantage, the entire saga is a small eddy in a much larger current. The Great Ones continue their obscure journeys. They reach for children through dreams and rituals, sometimes achieving a fragile contact, sometimes leaving only grief and madness in their wake. Human institutions rise up around the traces of those contacts, constructing doctrines and courts, churches and covenants, each convinced that it has found the correct posture toward the incomprehensible. The old blood moves through veins and chalices and stone, changing everything it touches and refusing to be contained. Cainhurst's rise and fall are one iteration of that pattern. In an age when Yharnam still thought it could master the blood, the castle tried to refine it into a crown for its own lineage. It succeeded in a way in producing a queen whose existence defied ordinary death. That very success made her a target for those who saw such independence as a threat. The ensuing collision froze an entire culture in a state of perpetual aftermath. In the end, the image that remains is simple. A pale castle on an isle half swallowed by mist, half defined by snow. A rooftop where a martyr once sat and where a hunter now stands, crown in hand. a hidden chamber where a queen either waits or has been reduced to warm flesh in a hunter's pocket. Servants that drift along endless corridors carrying empty trays. Bat-faced creatures perched against a cold sky waiting to swoop. A letter in a clinic addressed to someone who does not yet exist. The threads of this story are not neatly tied. They fray into the broader tapestry of Bloodborne's world, crossing other histories, other sins, other attempts to reach for the great ones and return unchanged. Cainhurst's pride, the church's control, the hunters caught between them, all become variations on a single quiet theme. When humans take the blood of distant beings into themselves and try to turn it into a tool, they do not simply gain power. They join a cycle they cannot fully see. The castle still stands. The sea still moves. The snow still falls, patient and unhurried, drifting down over stone that remembers both music and screams, covering bones and footprints alike, softening all distinctions into a single unbroken white. Somewhere within that gentle hush, in a room that sometimes exists and sometimes does not, a queen straightens slightly on her throne and listens for the sound of approaching footsteps that may or may not come. The story rests there, not concluded but quiet, folded like a letter whose ink has dried while the sender and recipient continue to change. Night in Yharnam does not end when the sun rises. It lingers in certain places, in certain stones and corridors, like a scent that no window can quite dispel. Cainhurst is one of those places. Even when the hunter leaves the isle and the coach rolls back into mist, something of the castle clings to them. A draft in a later hallway feels colder than it should. A distant bell rings, and for a moment it sounds like it is striking against that frozen sea. The dream remembers it too. In the hunter's respite, where grass moves in a wind that never changes and lamps burn with a light that never needs oil, there are shelves of forgotten weapons and relics. Not all of them belong to the city. A wheel leans against a wall, its spikes dulled by centuries of imaginary use. A silver sword rests among saws and cleavers, its balance too fine for the rough work most hunters prefer. Sometimes when the hunter turns away, these things seem to shift slightly, as if looking for a hand that will claim them again. The dream is a gathering place for many lives, and Cainhurst has left its share. There were hunters who once came from that castle long before the raid, men and women whose families held land and title but still chose to walk out into the world with steel in their hands. Some went to Yharnam to see the church's miracle up close. Some were sent as envoys or spies. Some were curious in the way only those who have never known hunger can afford to be. Their deaths folded into the dream like all the others, and in that neutral ground, the distinctions between Vileblood and church hunter, noble and commoner, blurred into shared scars. If the hunter listens when everything is quiet, the dream is full of small traces. A snatch of old court music remembered by someone who once stood in Cainhurst's ballroom. The ghost of a phrase in a language older than Yharnam, spoken by a Thumerian guardian whose blood helped shape both the church and the castle without ever knowing either. The faint click of a crown being lifted and set down again, over and over as a mind circles a choice it cannot unmake. Cainhurst is not the only place that tried to refine blood into destiny. Far below the city in chalice depths most hunters never see, there are chambers where another queen once walked. Her face appears again and again in carvings, statues, and summoned phantoms, veiled, stained, unblinking. She carried a child whose existence rippled out through time like a bell tone that never fully stopped. The healing church built much of its work on the remnants of her civilization. Every vial of old blood, every ritual of communion, every hunt, is a distant echo of a decision made in her age. If that Thumerian queen is a root, Cainhurst and Yharnam are branches. One branch tried to rule through healing and doctrine, offering blood to the many. The other tried to rule through refinement and inheritance, concentrating blood in a single line. Both believed themselves to be guiding their people toward a higher state. Both measured their success in lives changed, bodies strengthened, dreams thickened with new colors. Neither fully understood that they were not climbing a ladder, but walking in circles within a pattern set by beings who do not measure time the same way. The Great Ones watch not as judges but as distant relatives. They do not reward virtue or punish vice in any simple sense. They respond instead to resonance, where human minds and blood currents align with their own strange rhythms. They draw near. Where desire for a child, a successor, an extension of self becomes strong enough, they lean in. Sometimes the result is a stillbirth that haunts a city. Sometimes it is a godlike spider that hides the truth in a lake of eyes. Sometimes it is simply a softening in the boundary between dreaming and waking. In this sense, Cainhurst's story is only partially about politics and bloodlines. It is also about longing. Annalise longs for a child. Logarius longs for a world where certain lines can be cleanly severed. Alfred longs for a cause uncomplicated by doubt. The hunters who join the Vileblood Covenant long for purpose and identity beyond the anonymous work of the hunt. Each of them reaches towards something that promises to stabilize a world they feel tilting beneath their feet. The Great Ones never fully answer any of them. Annalise's throne remains empty of a child. Logarius's vigil does not undo what was done in the castle's halls. Alfred's triumph lasts only until his heart stops beneath a statue no one comes to visit. The Vileblood knights who swear themselves to the queen gain a name and a chalice, but they do not escape the cycle of death and return. Their resonance draws attention but not resolution, yet the longing itself leaves marks. It is there in the statues of Cainhurst, faceless figures holding vessels, hands outstretched as if eternally offering or begging for blood. It is there in the torn portraits where unknown artists captured lines of pride and hunger in oil. It is there in the way the servants, even in death, continue to act as if someone might walk through the doors at any moment who deserves their perfect curtsy. Even the lost children on the ramparts seem to embody a kind of incomplete wish. Half stone, half flesh, half bat, half human, they belong fully to no category. They watch the horizon as if expecting something to appear, some signal that their half-made state will one day be resolved. It never comes. They leap instead at whoever passes closest, repeating the only script left to them. Defend a castle that no longer knows their names. Yharnam's nightmares are full of such unfinished beings. In the nightmare frontier, swollen giants toss rocks with the distracted boredom of children who were never taught another game. In the gardens around Byrgenwerth's echo, scuttling kin thrash and twist as if trying to escape a shape someone else chose for them. In the old hunter's nightmare, figures who once walked proudly through the waking city are trapped forever in the moment when their devotion tipped into excess. Cainhurst is gentler, in its own cold way. There are no crowds howling in the streets, no burning districts, no piles of corpses at crossroads. There is snow and wind and the whisper of cloth. There is the occasional flurry of violence when a visitor arrives, but in between those brief eruptions, the castle is mostly quiet. It feels less like a battlefield and more like a museum where the exhibits have forgotten they are being watched. Perhaps that is why it stays in the mind. Cities fall in storms, eruptions, floods of flame. Castles usually fall the same way. Cainhurst did not. It was broken in a night of internal slaughter, then left standing, its stones intact, its layout unchanged. The damage is intimate. Smashed glass, overturned chairs, blood on a stair that no one bothered to scrub. The architecture survived, the meaning drained away. In the long view, that is another of Bloodborne's small jokes. So many groups in this world believe they can secure their legacy through structures. The Healing Church builds cathedrals atop the old labyrinths. Cainhurst raises its spires over the sea. Hunters establish workshops and dream proxies where their tools and techniques can be preserved. Yet what lasts strongest is not any one institution, but the shared pattern of approaching power, misusing it, and then trying to hide the consequences. A scholar takes blood into a castle and calls it refinement. A cleric takes blood into a cathedral and calls it sacrament. A hunter takes blood into their own veins and calls it necessity. Each step feels distinct from the inside. From above, they look similar, 3 variations on a single movement. Drawing something alien toward oneself and trusting that intention will be enough to tame it. Cainhurst's rise and fall sit neatly between those other 2 mirrors. On one side, ancient Pethumeru, whose queen's grief echoes across time. On the other, modern Yharnam, whose church dresses scientific experimentation in incense and ritual. In the middle, a pale castle whose queen tries to compress that entire arc into a single lineage, from human to great one child in as few generations as possible. The attempt fails, but in failing it produces stories, and the stories are what the dream keeps. Long after hunters stop walking Yharnam streets, long after the last beast has either been culled or transformed into something unrecognizable, Cainhurst will still exist as a place that can be reached, if only in memory. The carriage will still appear for those who carry the right letter in their pocket. The ghosts will still bow, the gargoyles will still wait, the queen will still sit on her throne in a room that may or may not currently be empty. There is a kind of peace in that, not the peace of justice where wrongs are balanced and debts repaid, but the peace of a story that is settled into its final shape. The details of who said what and who struck first have been worn down by time. What remains is the mood, cold pride, sudden violence, endless aftermath. A hunter arriving at Cainhurst does not need to know every piece of its history to feel the weight of it. The castle communicates in simpler terms: wind, stone, silence, blood. For a listener drifting toward sleep, that is enough. They can imagine the sound of hooves on snow, the creak of an old carriage door, the first glimpse of those white towers through mist. They can picture a queen who refused to die, a martyr who refused to leave, and a ruin that refused to collapse. They can let those images float and blur at the edges, becoming less about specific names and more about the pattern they trace. Rise, ambition, Contact, corruption, judgment, silence, snow. Somewhere between those last two words, thought loosens. The castle, with all its secrets and tragedies, recedes into the distance, crossing back over the water into the half-place where old stories live when no one is telling them. The hunter closes their eyes. The sea goes on moving, unseen. Cainhurst remains what it has become, a fixed point in a shifting world, a white thorn against a dark horizon, a reminder that even in a universe of gods and nightmares, some of the most enduring ghosts are simply the echoes of human pride and the quiet, stubborn wish not to be forgotten.